Hello and welcome to lesson 1B of the Thomas Egenes Sanskrit course. We resume at page 5 of the written book, and we're doing the grammar and the exercises, which cover pages 5, 6 and 7. For the iPad sharing, I will be using the same document as for lesson 1A, so lesson 1A and lesson 1B will all be on the same PDF. It starts here talking about Sanskrit roots, and I mentioned in the previous video, and I emphasize again, please do see the other video that I did a while ago called Roots and Stems. It's quite important that you should understand what we're talking about when we're talking about roots and stems. I'll just cover it fairly briefly here though. So reading from the book at page 5, the Sanskrit roots are divided into 10 classes, gana, in order to form the present stem. We shall study the first 4 classes whose stems end in a. The root dhatu, written with the square root symbol, before it forms the stem, which is the anga, and the stem adds an ending, here called a ting, to form a verb, tinganta. Now let's just go through some of this rather obscure, magical sounding vocabulary here. Let me share my screen with you. Here we go. Gana, so the roots, Sanskrit roots are divided into 10 classes. That's the gana. Gana means, actually originally means a herd or a flock. And in fact, Ganesh, the god Ganesha, in some Ganesha is the Gana. Isha, Gana meaning a herd, flock, group of animals, and Isha meaning the god. So Gana Isha becomes by something Ganesha. So Gana, it's just another word that they use for groups or classifications. These ganas are rather like the different conjugations in Latin, and in some of the modern languages, French and Spanish and Italian have their different conjugations of verbs. But we'll learn those as we go along. We're studying first of all the simpler one. That's where the stem ends in an a. There are 4 ganas, 4 classes of verb where the stem ends in an a. We'll look at that in more detail as we go along. There's nothing frightening about that. This, in fact, is they can be lumped together as one, effectively. Now, let's look at this root. The root, we use the square root symbol as the mathematical symbol, like a tick, meaning a square root. We use that just as a symbol. It's over the last century or so, linguists have come to use that symbol just to indicate a root. And a root is the irreducible element of a language. You can't get any smaller without fragmenting it into individual letters which are meaningless on their own. In fact, the Sanskrit word for root, the word given on this page is dhatu. The original meaning of dhatu actually means an element, as in a chemical element. In other words, the element is not reducible into smaller units. All of the atoms of that element, all of the molecules of that element are identical. You can't find, if you have the element gold, you can't get to anything else by analyzing it further and further down. So that was why the ancient Sanskrit grammarians used that word as the irreducible minimum. So let's look at this word, this root gum, meaning to go. No coincidence that it looks a bit like our English word come, because they are from the same origin, but go and come are both. They look very different in modern English, but they're both from the same Proto-Indo-European root, the gum. Now, the good professor in the Australian National University series talks about a magical process by which the present stem is formed from the root. Well, I don't go quite as far as the good professor does in calling it magical. In the case of gum becoming stem gacha, it's simply irregular. It's just a slightly irregular verb. But he's introduced it, Thomas Egenes has introduced it at this early stage because it is one of the most common verbs of the language. Gacha. So having told you that there is an irregularity, is it already introducing a slightly irregular verb in lesson 1b? That's the bad news. You'd expect to see something like he goes would be gamati, but no, that doesn't exist. It's gachati. That's the bad news, is there's a bit of irregularity here. The good news is that once you know that the stem is gacha, then it will conjugate completely regularly on that stem gacha throughout the whole of what is known the present system. In other words, that's the present tense as such, the imperative, the optative, and the imperfect. So once you've got this one, once you know the root is gum, the present stem is gacha, then you've got the entire present system, which is the vast majority of all instances of verbs in classical Sanskrit are based on the present system. So we've got the root gum, the stem gacha, and from this stem we form the actual verbs, first person, second person, first person. I'll explain in a moment why they're put in reverse order. So he, she, or it goes is gachati. Gachati. You go, in the singular, is gachasi. I go, ends in a me. But the R is lengthened, gachami. You will notice here, those of you who have studied Latin, that there's this characteristic t of the he, she, or it, and the characteristic s of the second person singular. In the Slavonic languages, it's the same. And the army, which actually corresponds with the Latin o and the Greek o, this m will turn up for the first person in various other conjugations. I was in Latin as eram, and so on. So these characteristics, s, t, and m, you will see reflected in other European languages. A word on why, on page 5, paragraph 2, he's put the third person first, second person second, and first person third. The reason for that is that in the European classical grammars, particularly Latin, we talk about the first person being I or we, the second person being thou, you, and the third person he, she, it, they. They do it the other way round. The Sanskrit grammarians do it the other way round. So the uttama or tritiya purusha means person. The Sanskrit grammarians, when they're talking about the first person, the pratama purusha, they actually mean he, she, it, or they. And the madhyama, literally the middle person, is you. And the uttama, which means last, or third in the series of 3, is I or we. So that's how the Sanskrit and the Pali grammarians number the persons: pratama, madhyama, uttama, first, middle, and last. in common with all, or certainly most, grammars written for Western students, and just because we're so used to what first, second, and third person means, we'll use these terms: first person, I, me; second person, you, same for both, of course; and third person, he, she, or it. But that will explain why they're given in reverse order here. And in Sanskrit verb tables, you will, some older grammars put the I first, but here this grammar gives the he, she, it first, followed by you, followed by I and we, which is the order in which the Sanskrit grammars do it. So we'll, in setting out the verb tables, we'll follow the order of the Sanskrit grammarians, but we'll call it by the words that we're used to. So you'll notice in the conjugation of this verb gam, gacha, called the stem gacha, and that gacha remains. There's a separate reason we won't bother with now. It's not gachami but gachami, is simply because that final a of the present stem always lengthens before an m or a v. A v is for the dual of the first person we too, and the m occurs for the I or dual we or plural we. That's just a phonetic phenomenon. It's just the gacha stem. So the stem remains the same with the gacha, and what distinguishes between he, you, I is the endings. Rather, as we see in modern Italian and Spanish, you don't need to say what the pronoun is because it's evident from the form of the verb, whether you're talking about third person, second person, or first person. In English, we have to say the pronoun unless it's otherwise understood, because the form of the verb doesn't tell us what it is. But in Sanskrit and Pali, and as I say, in languages like Italian and Spanish, and of course the Slavonic languages as well, the form of the verb will tell you which person is meant. So you tend to use the pronoun only for emphasis, or in a case where there is potentially some lack of clarity. Otherwise, it's normally omitted. So rather than saying sa gachati, he goes, it's enough to say gachati. And in Sanskrit, this is known as the eka vachana. Eka means one, vachana, voice, literally the one voice. In other words, the singular. Now going over to the vocabulary, this is now on page 6. A very small vocabulary for this lesson. They get bigger as we go along. We have already seen root gum, present gachati, that's the third person singular, gachati, he goes. This word cha, meaning and, it's an indeclinable. Indeclinable means it never changes its form. It's not like gachami, gachasi, gachati, and so on. It always remains the same. Note in particular that it's what's known as an enclitic. That means it follows the word that it links. So in other words, and I go is gachami cha. You couldn't say cha gachami, gachami cha. And in that respect, it's very similar. In fact, etymologically closely related to the Latin word que, meaning and. There are two words for and in Latin. One is et, which is placed in the same place as the English and something, or in Latin you would have something que, which means and something. So cha follows the word that it relates to, just like the Latin que. Now, the other word in the vocabulary is the root prach, and the present stem is prichati. Again, don't fret about why it changes from prach to prichati. There are rules about that that are actually quite sensible and logical and relatively easy to learn that we will be encountering as we go along. For the moment, just remember prichati, he asks, prichasi, you ask, prichami, I ask. And it says about some words not having endings, that's the indeclinable, that's the avyaya. The vyaya means actually disappearing or going away. So avyaya, rather like decline, really. If something declines, it goes into a decline, fades away. That same word is used for declining nouns, and also some talk about conjugating verbs, that you can decline verbs. If it's indeclinable, this avyaya, it remains unchanged, like the word cha that we have just had. And some words, it says, are treated as indeclinable. Swasti, which literally means well-being. Su asti becomes well-being. As in the Thai greeting, sawati, it's that same word, sawati. The Thais pronounce it swasti. It, oddly enough, the suastika means the sign of well-being. It was brutally taken over by the wrong people in a sad period of the last century in the form of swastika, but that comes from Sanskrit swastika, just means the sign of well-being. So we will now go on to the sample sentences. Oops. So the first one, we're at the bottom of page 6 now. It's just gachami. Note that in English we can say I go, but we also have the present continuous tense, I am going. That distinction is not made in Sanskrit, just as, for example, it's not made in various European languages. For example, French cannot make that distinction, although modern Spanish and modern Italian can. So he asks and I go. This is now an example of the cha being an enclitic, that means tacked onto the end of the word that it joins. In English, he asks and I go. In Sanskrit, you say prichati gachami cha. Literally, he asks, I go, and. So, prichati gachami cha. Notice that the next sentence after that, translated exactly the same in English, is prichati cha gachami cha. So in other words, the extra cha can be put in. It doesn't change the meaning. You can either put it in or leave it out. So prichati gachami cha, prichati cha gachami cha, they mean pretty much the same. It's a matter of style whether you use that extra cha or not. And in the last sentence on that page, bottom of page 6, gachasi cha, prichasi cha. You go and you ask. So gachasi prichasi cha. You could say, perfectly correct to say gachasi prichasi cha. You go and you ask. But you can insert the second cha. Sometimes that could be translated in English with more of an emphatic way, like you both go and ask. You're doing both things. You both go and ask. Sometimes it has that emphatic meaning. It's a matter of context and style, how you would translate that into English. So now we will come to the exercises. I won't read paragraphs 1 to 4 to you, but we'll go on to paragraph 5, which is translation of the sentences into English. Now, what we'll do here, to be as good as my word in emphasizing the importance of the spoken rather than the written word in Sanskrit, is if you feel able, put the written material away. I will unshare my screen. There we go. And I will read out these simple sentences in Sanskrit. I'll read them out slowly and with a pause. I'll read each one out twice and just try to hear it and understand it as I read it. And after each one, I'll give the translation into English. But do your best to try to treat this as an oral exercise rather than just an exercise in following it in the book. Oh, here we go. It's prichasicha gachaticha. Notice that the first of those two verbs had a si at the end, prichasi, and the second had a ti at the end, gachati. Prichasicha gachaticha. So that means you ask and he goes. Prichasicha gachaticha. Next one, gachami prichamicha. Gachami prichamicha. In both of those verbs, you will have noticed the ami ending, characteristic of the first person singular, meaning I. Gachami prichamicha. I go and I ask. The third one, pricheticha gachaticha. Notice T at the end of both. Pricheticha gachaticha. He asks and he goes, or he both asks and goes. D. Gachasi prichamicha. Gachasi prichamicha. So gachasi, you go. Prichamicha, and I ask. Next, prichati prichamicha. Prichati prichamicha means he asks and I ask. Prichati prichamicha. F. Gachasicha gachaticha. Again, the only difference here is in the verb endings. Gachasicha gachaticha. You go and he goes. I should mention that these sentences are hyper simple, that in real life, if you say something like he asks and I ask, you'd probably put it in a different way. You would use the pronouns there to emphasize both he and I am doing the same thing. But to keep it grammatically simple, we won't go into that quite yet. So next one, prichami gachasicha. Prichami gachasicha. I ask and you go. Prichaticha gachamicha. Notice the ati and ami. So prichaticha gachamicha. he asks, and I go. Now we will come to the English into Sanskrit exercises. I'll read them in English and see whether you can just produce them orally in Sanskrit. I go and I ask. Gachami, prichami cha. And you could put the second, the cha, after the first verb as well, so it would be equally correct to say either gachami, prichami cha, or gachami cha, prichami cha, both equally correct. And the same applies to all of the following sentences where we have an and in them. So you ask and he goes. So, prichasi gachati cha. Prichasi gachati cha. He asks and you go. Prichati cha gachasi cha. Or prichati gachasi cha. He goes and asks. That's the same he. Gachati prichati cha. Or gachati cha prichati cha. You ask. Prichasi. Prichasi. I ask and you go. Prichami gachasi cha. Or prichami cha gachasi cha. I go and you go. Gachami gachasi cha. Or gachami cha gachasi cha. He goes and you go. Gachati gachasi cha. Or gachati cha gachasi cha. And that concludes lesson 1B.